Thank you, everyone. Is that better? Yeah. So you missed that joke. Just laugh a little bit for me. Thank you. Ever since I was a young boy, I've enjoyed visiting cemeteries. What started out as a fascination with spirituality and an attempt to understand what happens to us after we die has turned into a lifelong hobby of visiting cemeteries across the United States and all over the world. I'd like to share 20 photographs from my cemetery travels with you tonight. The first cemetery is Forest Hills. This is in San Elmo, just outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. It was founded in 1880, and it contains many notable residents of Chattanooga. And on October 25th, they're having a cemetery walk, so be sure to check them out. Sorry, I forgot to give you the go-ahead. So from notable cemeteries to derelict cemeteries, I like visiting them all. This cemetery is in Harrison, Tennessee. It's Ray Cemetery, and it's completely overgrown on a piece of neglected farmland. The only way I was able to tell this is an actual cemetery was from the sunken-in grave sites. There are a few field stones scattered around. Any Ramones fans in the audience? Yeah. This is Johnny Ramone, and he's buried in Hollywood Forever Cemetery, and obviously he had a bit more than just a regular field stone. Now, not all cemeteries are devoted to humans. This is the Coondog Cemetery in Alabama, and it contains the remains of over 300 purebred coondogs. Now, at least one of these coondogs was killed by being run over by an automobile, but many of the coondogs have epitaphs written by their owners. So there was one coondog run over, but this gentleman was a cantankerous fellow in his town in Alabama, and the townfolk decided that he would be run over every day. So they buried him under the main street just outside of the cemetery walls. Now, cemeteries can be dangerous. This is a cemetery in Toxteth, England, just outside of Liverpool. And this sign warns of unstable ground and cemetery markers that can topple over and fall on visitors and crush them, causing injury and possible death. I think it's important to maintain these tombstones, and I'm involved in leveling ground and resetting tombstones. This protects them for decades to come. It protects not only the grave markers themselves, but the visitors to the cemeteries to keep both of them safe. So this is a cemetery in Scotland, and the imagery that you see is the carvers in the 1500s. It's their attempt to explain their vision of what happens to us after we die. They kind of have morbid imagery in the 1500s, and they often show skeletal remains. And that idea bled over into the colonial cemeteries. This is a burying ground in Boston, Massachusetts. And many of the markers you can see have inscriptions and symbology known as memento mori. One of these imageries is called the winged death's head. And it's an attempt to explain that as the body shuffles off its mortal coil, the soul rises into heaven on angels' wings, looking back on the earth with hollowed out eyes, as if to say, be careful, because as you are now, so once was I, but as I am now, so you will be. So it's not all morbid imagery. This is a depiction of Jesus Christ that I found in a cemetery in New Mexico. He's also housed under what's called a grave house, which is common in western Tennessee, Louisiana, and certain parts of New Mexico. So there's morbid imagery, there's uplifting imagery, and then there's also personal imagery depicting the important things of the person's life. Obviously, this guy loved music, and can you guess what he was known as on Earth? DJ Nasty. So this is a cemetery outside of the Grand Canyon. It's located at 7,000 feet elevation, and it contains the remains of many of the notable inhabitants of Grand Canyon and also people who died within the canyon walls. It includes the remains of about 300 people who died in an airplane crash in Grand Canyon. This is another Arizona cemetery. The cemeteries in our part of the world, as you saw earlier, when they fall into neglect, they become overgrown with vegetation. In the desert, they become covered up by sand. So while desert cemeteries have wide open spaces, the cemeteries in New Orleans, Louisiana are packed very close together, or at least the grave sites are packed very close together. And also the crypts are used multiple times because they have such limited land use. Also, many of these are below sea level, so they build it up to protect from flooding. This summer, we had a cemetery and gravestone conference, and I gave a lecture on how to use my new quadcopter to document cemeteries from the air. It's very important to document cemeteries and keep proper records of them because cemeteries can fall into disrepair and also succumb to natural disasters. This is the current Key West Cemetery in Key West, Florida. The original Key West Cemetery was destroyed by a hurricane in 1846, and many of the bodies were scattered out to sea and in the local treetops. Another natural disaster, this is in Hawaii, and this cemetery near Kalapana, Hawaii, was covered up from a 1986 lava flow from Kilauea. Through records, the local residents were able to excavate the ground and find all of the known grave markers. So getting back to one local cemetery again, it's important to maintain the cultural aspects of our cemetery. This is Mount Etna Cemetery, located on Mount Etna in Haletown, and it is being encroached upon by subdivisions and by development, and I think it's vitally important that we maintain the cultural aspects of all of our cemeteries. I'm known as the cemetery detective. I love cemeteries. If you have cemeteries to share with me, find me on Facebook or visit my website, thecemeterydetective.com. Thank you for letting me share my hobby with you this evening.